America's Misguided Policy Towards Ethiopia by Achamyeleh Tamiru, taken from Facebook page. In the last several decades, Ethiopia has been one of America's closest allies in Africa. To date, Ethiopia remains the top recipient of American foreign aid in Africa. However, recently, American Ethiopian relationship is increasingly strained. Since the chaotic Trump presidency in general, and in November 2020 in particular, Ethiopians both at home and in the diaspora are adopting a more critical attitude towards American action and inaction concerning Ethiopia. Among others, the ongoing war in the Tigray region between the terrorist group called Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the Ethiopian government forces is a source of tension between the two countries. America's insistence to preserve TPLF's conquest of Amhara provinces that were occupied and forcefully annexed into Tigray in 1991, when it assumed state power without any due process by changing the age-old border between Gondar and Tigray and Wollo and Tigray, has been at the core of Ethiopia's ongoing most destructive and volatile conflict. In a series of official statements issued by US Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken, America has argued the need for the recognition and preservation of TPLF's conquest of Amhara provinces into the pre-war borders and territorial status quo of Tigray. In his most recent public statement, Secretary Antony Blinken, for example, advocates for the territorial status quo and against any change in the internal and international borders of Ethiopia. Soon after the series of statements by American officials, many Ethiopians began to change their views on America and become skeptical of the motive of what they believe are decidedly pro-TPLF take on the conflict. While there are many issues over which America and Ethiopia differ, America's insistence on the return to the pre-war border, where provinces of North Gondar and North Wollo have been forcefully annexed from the Amhara region and given a name of Western Tigray and Southern Tigray respectively by the occupying force that is TPLF. Preserve Tigray's status quo and in the occupied territories, and the endorsement of this territorial status quo of Tigray has been the most perplexing to many Ethiopians. While the immediate reaction to Blinken's statement was one of outrage and disbelief, it has recently elicited sharp criticism and anti-America social media campaigns. As I write this line, many Ethiopians unsettled by Blinken's biased statement are actively participating in a Twitter campaign denouncing him under various hostile and critical hashtags. Recent American policy towards Ethiopia bred resentment and outrage among many people because they closely and increasingly resonate with the position TPLF has taken on several issues. One of the conditions the TPLF set for peace talks with the Ethiopian government is a refusal to relinquish its control of occupied territories and the restoration and preservation of the pre-war unjust, not to mean colonial borders of Tigray. American advocacy for the territorial status quo of the pre-war unjust borders of Tigray, therefore, favors the claims and demands of TPLF. Blinken's statement in favor of the territorial status quo of the pre-war unjust borders of Tigray is considered pro-TPLF and therefore anti-Ethiopia. Blinken's statements regarding the border issue are out of touch with public opinion and unencumbered by knowledge of the history of the territorial occupation of TPLF that led to, among other things, the current war in Ethiopia. It's apparent that America formed its policy about the border based on information fed to the Foreign Secretary by TPLF. In the view of many Ethiopians, TPLF is a terrorist organization and remains the greatest single danger to the peace and very survival of the Horn of Africa. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, America's support to an organization seen by many Ethiopians as unlawful deeply outrages them. Some Ethiopians are also outraged at Secretary Blinken's statement because of his insistence on the recognition of and preservation of Tigray's unjust pre-war borders. That was one of the main reasons leading to the current conflict in the first place. Although the Ethiopian constitution, TPLF manifesto, has no provision regarding administrative borders, Blinken prescribes that the pre-war internal and international borders must not be modified in violation of the constitution. Blinken is woefully ignorant of the fact that both the current Ethiopian constitution and internal administrative borders were forcefully imposed on the country by TPLF in 1991 and are therefore illegitimate in the eyes of many Ethiopians, and even this very same constitution is mute on the matter. The constitution referenced in Blinken's statement about the border is nothing more than a repackaged TPLF anti-Amhara and anti-Ethiopian secessionist manifesto issued in 1976 when the particularistic Tigrayan ethno-nationalists launched their guerrilla movement against Ethiopia. There is a growing consensus among Ethiopians that the deeply unjust territorial status quo of Tigray has caused and continues to cause misery and tragedy of millions of people over the last several decades. Ethiopia's internal regional administrative borders were reconfigured arbitrarily based largely on ethnic criteria in 1991 by the TPLF government. These ethnic states and administrative regions closely resemble the ethnic homelands pejoratively called Bantustan, the intensely racist apartheid regime of South Africa created in the 20th century. Like their Southern African Bantustan counterparts, the ethnic regional states and homelands in Ethiopia have decrepit, outdated, and inflexible borders. Like the apartheid regime, TPLF created these ethnic homelands to divide Ethiopians and breed mutual suspicion and conflict among each other. Many people were opposed to the current ethnic-based regional borders, both at the time of their creation in 1991 and subsequently. The territorial dispute has been a highly destructive force and consumed Ethiopian national politics since 1991. The ongoing conflict in Tigray shows painfully and clearly the urgent need to undo the deeply flawed territorial status quo. Ensuring peace in Ethiopia is therefore predicated upon abolishing inflexible borders and overcoming territorial conflicts. Conversely, supporting and preserving and defending the unjustified Tigray borders would carve them into stone and thus perpetuate the conflicts and the allied bloodshed instead of resolving them. The statements by Blinken and others like him are underwriting and adding new fuel to the already raging irredenist fire in Ethiopia. Irresponsible, ill-conceived, ill-informed statements such as Blinken's will only deepen the Amhara and Tigray division instead of overcoming it. For the 500,000 Amhara in Wollo, an Amhara province, TPLF illegally occupied for over 3 decades and still claims as Western Tigray. The recognition of the pre-war borders would be a blatant betrayal and return to certain bloodshed and suffering. Virtually any kind of TPLF presence in Wollo would lead the renewed bloodshed and massacre of the Amhara who live there. Given the continued clear and evident threat the TPLF presents to the Amhara in particular and Ethiopians in general, the American advocacy to the territorial status quo is to most people prejudiced and unfair at best and irresponsible and inflammatory at worst. What is to be gained from making such a damaging statement? Instead of trying to promote reconciliation and heal divisions, the incendiary statement by Blinken would exacerbate an already violent and precarious situation with his belligerent and divisive rhetoric. Blinken's partisan statement further undermines the sovereignty of Ethiopia and encourages ongoing violence. It should be up to the Ethiopian people to determine the legitimate borders of their own country and administrative regions. It's beyond Washington's purview to decide upon which Ethiopian regional borders it legitimizes and supports and which ones it rejects and delegitimizes. Competing ethno-nationalism and the allied irredenist conflicts are shredding the national fabric of Ethiopia into thousands of pieces and threatening to destroy it altogether. Thus, given the many territorial disputes that exist in Ethiopia, Blinken's incendiary statement could potentially reignite a new wave of disputes elsewhere in Ethiopia. Undue intervention and unwarranted statements by US officials have done little to prevent violence and destruction. It bears repeating that Blinken's statement is counterproductive because it could only help to entrench rather than to overcome territorial disputes and ethnic sentiments. It's apparent that America has learned little from its history. The current pressure which America is putting on Ethiopia is an air reminder of previous Western intervention on several Middle Eastern and Asian countries that led to state collapse and allied violence and atrocities. The tragedy and fate of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen are an object lessons in which in the perils of misguided US foreign policy and intervention. The United States has to learn from its recent history and avoid undue intervention in Ethiopia with potentially deadly consequences. The US can contribute to a stable peace in Ethiopia by supporting the country's effort on overcoming the rigidity of ethnic state borders and promoting integration. I believe that achieving stable peace in Ethiopia and cultivating good relations and friendship with Ethiopia constitute the primary goal of American foreign policy. Despite Ethiopian priorities and distinct interests, I also recognize that America has the right to pursue its foreign policy and security interests as it deems fit or appropriate. However, American insistence on the preservation of Tigray's pre-war unjust borders and demands for the withdrawal of Amhara security forces from areas rightly theirs is grossly unfair and inaccurate. Secretary Blinken and other US officials have made such repeated statements without careful nuancing. The advocacy for or against the territorial status quo and the withdrawal of Ethiopian security forces from certain areas must consider the history of those Amhara territories that were conquered by TPLF in 1991 and forcefully annexed into Tigray, and the complicated play of factors that led to the current Tigray conflict. The administrative boundary, historical geography, social and population history of Wollo, Tigray, and Amhara, and that of Raya provinces of Ethiopia from ancient times to the 1990s had never been controversial or a matter of debate. Anyone interested in the administrative boundary, historical geography, social and population history of Wollo, Tigray, and Amhara provinces of the area can read the well-documented The Wollo Affairs book that includes more than 700 primary and secondary sources from archives in and outside of Ethiopia. The TPLF-dominated region remapped and reorganized the internal administration of the country based on ethnic and language criteria in 1991. In total, 9 ethnic regional states plus Addis Ababa city administration were created, while the predominantly Amharic speaking and Amhara majority province of Raya to the south of the historic Tigray province was forcefully incorporated into Tigray regional state in 1991. Walqait, Agade, Talamt, and Humara were illegally occupied by TPLF as early as the early 1980s. The spatial, historic, and the natural boundary of Tigray with the Amhara province of Begemder and Semen, renamed Gondar in 1975, was the Tekkeze River. East of the Tekkeze was the historic Truru Tigray, until 1991, when they forcefully, formally occupied it and renamed it Western Tigray. Historically, Walqait, Tagari, Talamt, and Humara had never been under Tigray province ever once. TPLF occupied Walqait, Tagade, Talamt, and Humara in the 1980s, although the then overwhelmingly Amhara and Amharic speakers, not for ethno-national reasons, but for strategic and economic reasons. Whereas historical Tigray is an environmentally deprived and fragile region, Walqait, Tagari, Talamt, and Humara are naturally endowed and agriculturally fertile land. Nearly 500,000 Tigrayans colonists were settled inland in Walqait by displacing the indigenous Amhara. Although TPLF had perpetrated horrendous crimes against the Amhara people in Raya, it was the people of Walqait that bore the brunt of TPLF's systematic and genocidal repression and violence. Indeed, the breadth and depth of TPLF's violence and crimes perpetrated against the Walqait Amhara people, stretching over a period of 4 decades, is yet to be systematically documented. TPLF is among the few terrorist organizations in the world that has promoted one of the most egregious and virulent cases of narrow and violent tribal politics. Its defining features are corruption, theft, hate, and violence. While TPLF was oppressive and violent across the board during its 27 years of misrule and massive theft of Ethiopia, the Amhara people were and still are the special object of its hate policies. Within occupied Walqait, in particular, TPLF was actively engaged in massive and relentless population purges, miscegenation, displacements, and extrajudicial killings to eliminate the Amhara people and their culture and transform the province into an ethnically homogeneous Tigrayan homeland. There are no acts of social engineering that the TPLF are not applied to disrupt the ethnic and cultural integrity of Amhara in Walqait. The claim of the Amhara over Walqait is not merely rooted in the conviction about borders of the ancestral homeland of the Amhara, but it's primarily based on ethnic sentiments. The issue of identity is a crucial matter in the Amhara Iranists' claim over Walqait. Since the time immemorial, Walqait has been an integral part of the majority Amhara inhabited part of Begemder and Samir. The people of Walqait were Amhara through and through. Walqait held profound meaning for the Amhara history, especially for Gondar history. It is a territory profoundly and deeply embedded into the Gondari soul. Walqait is deeply ingrained in the imagination, cultural ethos, psyche, and identity narratives of the Gondari Amhara people. Walqait is a land that the Gondari cannot do without. As indicated above, in the 1980s, TPLF militarily occupied Walqait. In 1991, it formally detached Walqait from the historic region of Begemder and Samir and placed it under the Tigray regional state in the face of violent resistance from the indigenous Amhara. In 2021, Walqait returned to Gondar. In between was at least half a century of bitter enmity between the Amhara and TPLF. To their peril, by incorporating Walqait, the Tigray region came to have a significant and proud Amhara population with its borders. The Amhara, especially the Amhara in Walqait, never recognized the new borders TPLF created between Tigray and Gondar. Western Tigray was never referred to as a part of Tigray. The lost territories in TPLF renamed as West Tigray are referred to by their historic name as Wolkite. The Amhara never condoned the dismemberment of the historic province of Gondar. TPLF responded to the peaceful Amhara request to reunification with Gondar with violence and repression. Yet, as the repression against the Wolkite Amhara intensified, so did the resistance and the longing for reunification with the Amhara region. The memory of Wolkite lived on. No Gondare could come to terms with the loss of Wolkite, which has so much meaning to them. The Wolkite Amhara fought back the TPLF occupiers with the force of arms, created songs and committees to work towards reunification with the Amhara region. The extremely popular song by the famous singer Fasil Demoz about the forceful occupation of Wolkite by TPLF, titled Arresut, literally means they plowed it, has had quite an electrifying effect on the Amhara people. Arresut unleashed an outpouring of Amhara consciousness and galvanized support to the Wolkite cause. It drew attention to the plight of the Wolkite Amhara who were suffering under TPLF hateful rule. Arresut reignited the movement for reunification, formulated the identity narrative and the attachment to Wolkite quite literally and radically. By singing his music, Fasil has contributed to keeping the Amhara people of Wolkite in the collective memory of the larger Amhara population of Ethiopia. TPLF's bellicosity made violence inevitable and caused havoc and misery in Wolkite and elsewhere in Ethiopia. In July 2016, the festering enmity and hostility between the Amhara people and TPLF over Wolkite flared up into a violent uprising when Colonel Dammeka Zawdu successfully resisted illegal arrest. In November 2020, the war between TPLF and the Ethiopian government broke out after the former attacked the Ethiopian army stationed in Tigray. The Amhara Special Force, along with the Ethiopian army, drove out TPLF from Wolkite. After 40 years of repression, genocidal violence and plunder, the Amhara people of Wolkite are liberated and reunited with the kith and kin. In reincorporating Wolkite into Gondar, the Amhara are not detaching a part of the territory of another regional state, but instead they are simply retrieving their ethnic kin, along with the ancestral homeland they have successfully inhabited for thousands of years, forcibly detached from Gondar. The Wolkite case is a salutary reminder of the risks involved in trampling on people's inalienable rights, cherished culture, and customs out of greed and for narrow ethno-nationalist interests. If the current ethnic federalism is allowed to continue indefinitely, stable peace in Ethiopia and the surrounding region will never be achieved. A return to the pre-1991 administrative division or the reconfiguration of the administrative boundaries of Ethiopia based on criteria less to do with language and ethnicity appears to be the only hope for keeping territorial disputes and the ensuing bloodshed at bay. The current rigid ethnic borders could only encourage narrow and short-sighted ethno-nationalism and offers no long-term solutions. This is the certain lesson for the case of Wolkite. Blinken and the US officials' support for the preservation of the pre-war borders that are misguided and are not grounded in history only adds to the already complex and interwoven problems facing Ethiopia. As a nation of freedom and liberty, the US should stand by the Wolkite Amharas who suffered genocidal ethnic cleansing and endured unimaginable violence under TPLF's brutal occupation of the area and support the struggle of the Amhara people of Wolkite against oppression, colonization, and TPLF terror by applying meaningful pressure on TPLF for the return of occupied territories in Gondar as well as Wollo. Reference: independent writer, commentator, Ethiopian Affairs, and economic researcher and analyst. A notable Wolkite Amhara who has been elected as the leader of Wolkite Amhara Identity Committee. And reference see Achamyeleh Tamiru, 2019, The Wolkite Affair. Thank you.